a lot of you are in now and probably will be trickling in the next few minutes. Without further ado, I would like to introduce you to our lecturer for today, Mr. Arthur Laudrain. He is a postdoctoral researcher in cyber diplomacy at King's College London and a strategic analyst in cyber policy at the Hague Center for Strategic Studies, which is otherwise known as HCSS and one of the organizers for this school. He is an expert on emerging technologies and international affairs, foreign interference in democratic processes, information manipulation, cyber strategies and doctrines for governments, think tanks, and the private sector. And today he will be giving a lecture on information manipulation and subversion of democracy. So we are excited for a very interesting lecture yet again today. And without further ado, Mr. Laudrain, the digital floor is yours.
Thank you, Stephanie. Can you still hear me properly?
Yeah,
yes,
hear you and see you, and your slides are up.
Great, perfect. So welcome everyone. Great to see so many of you here today. So yes, I will talk about election interference, information manipulation, and overall subversion of democracy. I've planned something that mixes policy and academic research. Most of what you will see today is based on the research I've conducted in the past 5 to 6 years as part of my PhD at the University of Oxford, and so that's why you see all the logos there on the corner of the slide. These are the institutions that sponsored my work. And I have been now since January a postdoc, a research associate at King's College London. So first of all, let's start with a summary of what I will talk about. So I will cover a couple examples, then go through a bit of historical background before moving on to the big research question that is going to keep us busy for a little bit less than an hour. I will present you a little bit of the conceptualization work I did on cyber-enabled election interference. This is important because this is not completely a new phenomenon, but some of its ramifications are new, and so we need to think a little bit about this. And then I'll go through the research design, my findings, and then try to open up a little bit on further research, and then I'll open the floor for questions. So on this slide, you see 3 pictures which represent 3 photographs of 3 candidates in elections or referendums in the UK case. So you have the US, France, and the UK in the years 2016, 2017. And I have these 3 photographs because they represent 3 electoral events, elections or referendums, that have something in common. And, you know, from the little snippets that you see on their bottom right side, I'm sure you can guess what they have in common. And this is that these states, these elections, were the target of cyber-enabled election interference. In all 3 cases, actually, by Russia. But this is not a phenomenon circumscribed to Russia. But in the years 2016, 2017, there was this wave of election interference with Hillary Clinton, Emmanuel Macron, and Boris Johnson, in the last case, leading the Brexit vote. So I'm pretty sure you have at least a rough knowledge of what happened, but I will summarize quickly. In the American and French case, Russian hackers, in a sense, hacked into campaign emails of both Macron and Clinton, and then leaked the content of these emails in the US case through WikiLeaks with the original content. In the French case, through a third party again, but with fabricated content. And in both cases, the aim was to diminish the likelihood that these candidates would get elected. In the Brexit case, things were a little bit different. Russian state media and troll farms, propaganda on social media, pushed pro-Brexit stories and comments during around 6 months to a year before the vote in 2016. And their audience was quite significant, at least as high as the official Brexit campaigns combined, because there was two of them. Another thing that these examples have in common is that in these three cases, the respective governments didn't do much in response to these election interference attempts. On this scale, you have the strongest example in terms of foreign policy response, which is the US. The Obama administration enacted sanctions, economic and diplomatic sanctions against Russia. But in the French, in the British case, very little happened. And even in the US case, even though there were sanctions, they took place only after the election took place, even though the interference began a month before the election. And so that begs the question, why democratic states in general tend to respond so little, so late to these forms of interference. And so that's what we're going to look into today. But first of all, let's take a little step back and look at traditional forms of foreign election interference, or FEI, because these are not a new occurrence at all. This is something that happened, as early probably as there was ever elections. But in terms of historical records, we have, the French meddling into the re-election of George Washington in 1796. You had, obviously, during the Cold War, a lot of election interference between the US and the USSR, with Italy being one example. And then between France and Germany, you had Germany supporting the election of Léon Gambetta in 1877. So these forms of interference in the traditional sense are not new. And we can define them as the intervention of a foreign power into the electoral ecosystem of a country, and that means the election process, the infrastructure that you use for the election, but also the political and the regulatory environment, and also the nature and the culture of your media and the state of public opinion. And all of this to achieve what? Well, to influence the political environment of the target, all the way up to influencing the election result directly. So these are the traditional historical forms of election interference. And so if we turn this into a research question, right? If we look into the more cyber-enabled forms of election interference and try to formulate this research question as a more academic question, this gives us this, right? Why do democratic states tend to underreact or underrespond in their foreign policy to cyber-enabled foreign election interference? Now, what is the difference between these older traditional forms of FEI and these cyber-enabled forms? Well, let's see a little bit what are the most prominent characteristics of FEI, right? You have, if you look at the literature, there's been an emerging literature since the late 2010s, early 2020s. And there's been a interesting debate in terms of concepts. And this is important because this shapes the rest of the conversation. Right? First of all, you have to agree on what you're talking about. So what are we talking about when we talk about cyber-enabled election interference? The first one is, do we talk only about influencing voters widely speaking? Do we also influence how they think, how ideas are shared, how the debates are held? Or do we look only at direct ballot manipulation, directly changing the votes electronically, for instance? The second debate is, do we look at covert action, or do we also include things like an ambassador or an embassy making a public statement in favor of a candidate in the country that they're seized in? That is open to debate again. The third one is about the nature of the vote itself. Do we focus only on votes of succession? So, for instance, a presidential election or parliamentary election? Or do we open up the field to all kinds of democratic processes? And the Brexit referendum is a different kind of democratic process. And then the last one, probably the most important one, is, do we only look at interference into the process of the election? So meddling into how votes are registered or votes are processed? Or do we look at interference into candidates, right? Trying to demean their campaign or their personalities by leaking documents, as this is what we've seen in the French and the British case. So all of these are important conceptual debates to keep in mind because they shape the rest of the debate going forward. Now that we've seen some of these characteristics, let's compare these older forms and newer forms of election interference. Again, interesting literature from either the early 2000s or 2020s. There are three key characteristics to me that really make a big difference with cyber-enabled election interference. The first one is that with social media, most notably, as a foreign power that is seeking to interfere in one of their neighbors, for instance, elections, you can reach individuals with very little to no filter. You have no editorial filter. So compared to a more traditional newspaper, you can push exactly the kind of content that you want. You have no intermediary except the platform, the social media platform, but that platform exercises very little editorial control. The second one is that the content is really tailor-made to the audience that you want to influence. So you can use some technical or demographic selectors to look at how people vote, what's their age, where do they live, all kind of selectors that traditionally come from the ads industry, right? And you can select very specific categories of people and try to influence them in a specific way. So in the US, you can influence racial minorities specifically and push them with a message that tells them, in a sense, to not go to vote. This is not worth it. This is what we've seen in the US, for instance. And the last point out of these three is the adaptability at short notice. Again, with traditional forms of election interference, designing and pushing a propaganda message takes quite a lot of time. It has a lot of cost as well. And you can't react really quickly to changes in the political life of the country that you're interfering in. And so this adaptability at short notice is really important. What are the implications? Why are these 3 points important? The most important one is that it's easy for foreign power to come in and seize the political window of opportunity. By this, I mean that it's easy to look at the domestic political campaign ongoing in the target state and see an emerging scandal or a point in the campaign that is going to be particularly distasteful or uh, a specific point in terms of values um, or immigration or something that is going to create a lot of division in the country. And once you see this, well, you can design a campaign very quickly, use this scandal or this divisive narrative, and then push the right message to the right group of people, and then, depending on what you've decided to do, send them the message that you want. So you can play on useful agents. That's what we call domestic enablers, and we've seen this in 2016 when Trump started asking for Clinton's emails to be leaked. And then you can act on deeply, deeply rooted divisions, right? And these divisions are, you can find them in most democratic campaigns, right? So in the US, you didn't have only the Trump versus Clinton, you also had within the Democratic campaign, the Clinton Sanders divide, right, for the primary. In the UK, you had the Brexiters versus the Remainers, a very dividing stance here. And then in Europe, more widely and elsewhere, you have a more liberal side and a more protectionist side. And foreign powers can come in and play with these divisions. So if we want to summarize, right, you can come up with a dedicated concept for what we're seeing, right? A new form of election interference that is cyber-enabled. And this is what I call sci-fi, right? Cyber-enabled foreign electoral interference. And what you need to remember is that they are quantitatively and qualitatively different from their traditional forms. First, they're more potent, right? As I said, I mentioned the costs aspect earlier. It's much cheaper and it's scalable. You don't need to put a lot more resources to reach out to scale up and reach out thousands, hundred thousands of people. It's quite accessible also. You don't need to have in-house experts teams of hundreds of people. You don't need even to be a state with cutting-edge intelligence services to do this. You can hire people, hire companies to do this on your behalf. This is what we call interference or influence as a service. And you have some price tags here on the right side of your screen. You could instigate a street protest for as little as $200,000. That sounds like a lot of money, obviously, for an individual, but for a state, this is really nothing. And so now that we've seen these salient characteristics, how do we define this new concept? Well, this is the definition that I've chosen, but of course, this is open to debate. But what I've chosen is adapting from the FEI definition and adapting it to its different characteristics, the intervention of a foreign power into, again, the electoral ecosystem of a country. To do what? Well, there are three different things you can do at least. You can polarize further the target society. We've seen how you can do this. You can just choose to undermine trust in the system, trust in democratic principles, because elections that are being interfered with are less trustworthy. And of course, you can go all the way to influencing the election results, but not necessarily. And how do you do this? Well, you leverage these new online mass communications characteristics that are direct access to people, the ability to push tailored content to specific demographics, and reactive engagement in a closed loop to the political developments of the campaign. So this is what we're studying and what we're talking about, right? And that in itself is, this is an important contribution because we need to be clear about what we're talking about. If you want to have what I've just said into a figure, this is what you have. You have your SAFI event with its three non-exclusive goals, and then you have different tools at your disposal, right? So I've mentioned doxing, which is hacking and leaking. You can use just disinformation campaigns, trolling, or go all the way into direct ballot manipulation. I won't repeat everything I've said, but this is a nice summary. So let's go back to the research question that I've mentioned earlier, right? Why do democratic states tend to underreact in their foreign policy response to these forms of attacks on their democratic principles? Well, to do this, so I've deployed what we call an inductive case selection system. So for those that are not necessarily familiar with inductive and deductive logic, inductive logic is when you have a look at the world, right? Simply speaking. So you look at cases or you look at empirical facts. And out of these observations, you try to induct some principles or rules, right? You see some potential cause and effect relationship, and you see, oh, maybe if it applies here, it applies elsewhere. In a sense, this is what inductive logic is. And so what I did is I looked at one important case that we call the geographic case to build a theory. Right? We look at the empirics of an important case, try to see some potential relations between variables, and then try to build a theory out of it that we can apply elsewhere. And then you test this theory in other cases to see if it applies as well. And if it successfully applies, then it means that maybe your theory has some ground, and that means that potentially you can apply it elsewhere, and you have some explanatory power there. And that's what we're trying to do in political science. That's not the only thing we try to do, but it's a big thing, one of the big things that we try to do in political science. So this is going to be more into the academic side of the presentation now. But I know that not all of you are academics, not all of you are researchers. So I'll try to not make it too difficult. If you have some questions, we can address them at the end of the presentation. So on top of an inductive case selection, I deployed a methodological synergy strategy, which means that I test my theory in different ways, right? So first, I take the first case that I use for building the theory. I analyze it from within, right? And then I test the theory across different cases, right? And each test with each case has different purposes, and I'll go into detail into how I do that afterwards. Let's look at the case selection first. This is what we call the universe of cases. This is the world if you look only at cyber-enabled election interference. And this is the first step when you do a case study, is to look at the potential cases you can choose for your case study. you are not going to perform a research on all of these cases, but you need to scan the world for potential cases, right? So I limited myself to the year 2010 to the 2020s for practical reasons. But this gives you already a pretty good idea of what we're dealing with. Again, there's some caveats with some cases that might not be considered interference. For instance, the German Bundestag hack. We know that a lot of data was leaked, was hacked, but was not leaked. So whether that constitutes interference is open to debate. But a lot of these are pretty well recognized as recognized instances of election interference. So now the idea is, which cases as a researcher do I choose to first, build a potential theory and then test it. And so what I did is that for the geographic case, I chose the US case, so the presidential election in 2016. And the selection criteria are quite evident here. It's an important case because Hillary Clinton lost the election, and so Donald Trump got elected. We don't know if that's a direct result of the interference, but the election of Trump was really a big event in 2016 and for world affairs. It is a very relevant case. It fits completely with what the puzzle that we're looking into, and it is a puzzling case, right? Why did the U.S. administration, the Obama administration specifically, wait until after the election to take action against Russia, even though it knew of the interference attempt month prior? And so I make several assumptions and hypotheses here. After I've done my initial analysis of the US case. I don't have the time to go through read the details of the US case, but so I'll move straight to my analysis, right? So doing my analysis of the US case, I make the first hypothesis. That first hypothesis is that when you have a hostile state that shows not only the ability, but also the willingness to interfere in your election, if you're a democratic leader, right? This represents a power differential, a very specific power differential to democratic leaders. Because democratic leaders will tend to consider the integrity of elections as a strategic interest, right? You want, as a leader, you want your election to be considered trustworthy. And the fact that you have a hostile state that is technically able and politically willing to come in and interfere with your election, that is a strong power differential. Because most likely, as a democracy, you don't want to do the same. You don't want to interfere in someone else's election. You can enact some sanctions. You can do other things. But it is something that you're more vulnerable to than your adversary. So it is a specific power differential here. The second hypothesis is that now that same component of power, right, that we just talked about, this is going to create different perceptions of the threat. So as a democratic leader, this threat that you feel, this threat of interference, you're going to perceive it differently depending on basically the state of your country. So how vulnerable your country is to interference. And that is going to be observable in terms of, how much of your vote takes place via electronic means, right? If you use electronic machines, are they vulnerable or not? Is your public opinion, very divided? Do you have high quality newspapers and media or not? Do you have laws and regulations that are and regulators right, that have proper powers to enforce electoral rules or not. All of these characteristics are going to make you more or less vulnerable to interference. And so I emphasize that democratic leaders are aware of these vulnerabilities and that this will color their perception of the interference threat. Final hypothesis. Once you've identified this threat as a foreign lead, as the democratic leader, the degree of consensus within your society, so how well your political elite and your public opinion is cohesive around the national interest, or on the contrary, how divided they are, this will influence how democratic leaders decide to respond to the identified threat. And this is because a head of state or government, they live in between two worlds, right? They live in the international realm. They engage in international relations. They engage with foreign leaders, but they are also the head of the party usually, or they have a primary role in the domestic politics of their country, right? Evidently, and so the foreign threat is obviously the threat of interference, but the domestic threat is when you go for an election, you usually put your seat at risk or your party's position at risk. And so the domestic threat is that you lose the election in very simple words, right? And so I hypothesize that if the degree of consensus within your society is low, and so what that means is that your society is divided, domestic political interests, which will be defending the perceived legitimacy of the election, the trustworthiness of the election, and so ensuring your political survival. These will prevail over the need to address the foreign threat of interference. And what that means for foreign policy is that your response will be delayed or otherwise inadequate, too late or too little. And that's what would explain what we've noticed with the first three case studies that we've seen earlier. If you put all these hypotheses together, this gives you the following theory, right? I won't go into the interstitial condition because that's we don't have time and it's not that essential. But in a sense, you find the independent variable here, the relative component of power imbalance. It's filtered by threat perception and domestic politics, and this gives you foreign policy and a response, right? This is how you go from the observation of one empirical case, you observe some relationship between variables, and then you try to build a theory that might explain this or that reflects this relationship and that may be explainable in other cases, right? And these are the concrete indicators, right? These are the variables and these are the concrete indicators that I've just mentioned earlier. Now, this is big and scary, but don't worry, I won't go into details too much. But this is how you operationalize a multi-stage case study analysis. So the important bit is that you see that the threat perception and the balancing of the threat, that changes whether you're looking at before the election happens or after it has taken place, because the balancing of interests is not the same. And so what I did is that I, once I've created this theory, I tested it in the French and UK cases, but in subsets, right? So I compared the before election subsets to the after election subsets. And this has a specific methodological purpose. We don't do this just because it looks fancy, but because it provides you with some specific tests to perform. And the idea is that by doing so, you multiply the number of comparisons that you do, right? So with only 3 cases, you can do 6 case subsets, right? 2 for each case. And so you can perform many more comparisons. And the more comparisons, the more data, and the more data, the more tests you can do. And this gives you more ground to say that your theory is grounded in reality and has explanatory power. Again, we can go back into the Q&A, but I want to give that. Yeah, I need to stop soon, so I won't go into detail here too much, but we can go back into the Q&A later. Now, the important part, I think, for all of you in the audience is the findings. And the findings is that democratic leaders, when they are confronted with a foreign power interfering in their elections, they face what I've called a lesser evil dilemma. And this is from the observation that leaders tend to favor addressing the domestic threat. And if you remember, the domestic threat is not being able to be re-elected, or the election being perceived by your population as not trustworthy. Let's go back to the US case. It appears from my research and other people's research as well, and journalistic inquiries, that Barack Obama was presented with the opportunity several times before the election to enact sanctions, respond to Russia covertly, overtly, strongly, a little bit less strongly, to say, look, we know what you're doing. We know that you're trying to interfere in the election. We're not going to let this happen. This is wrong. And this is red line for us. But Obama chose not to. He chose to wait after the election took place. Why? First, it appears that it's, well, because like a lot of other people, he thought that Hillary Clinton would be elected anyway. And so it was not that necessary. And also because it might have been counterproductive. If you maybe remember from back then, Donald Trump was already arguing that the elections were rigged against him. He was calling the election unfair. And so if Obama would have gone public and said, look, Russia is trying to mess with our elections and favor Trump, the Republicans might have said, oh, well, this is just Obama trying to help his friend Hillary Clinton get elected after him. He's not being fair in administering the election, and he is diminishing the public office, is diminishing our democratic institutions. That's the domestic threat in very concrete terms. Right? So Obama did not want to get involved in this. He didn't want to give a potential ground to be attacked and be criticized for not being a neutral party in the administration of the election. And different mechanisms took place in the French and British cases. We don't have time to go through them, but this is a pretty consistent mechanism that we can observe. The second point, and this is visible in the Brexit case now, is that you might have an alignment of interests. When the interests of the party align with, or the party or the democratic leader, when they align with the interfering power and their interference, then the party or the leader might choose the party's interest before the national interest. And that is very dangerous, right? So in the Brexit case, for instance, Russia was pushing for the Brexit vote to succeed. And Boris Johnson, when he took over after David Cameron resigned, right? He also was in favor of Brexit, right? And he did his best to deliver Brexit. Theresa May after him as well. And so the idea here is that if Boris Johnson or Theresa May would have gone public and said, look, Russia tried to interfere in the election, they did, maybe they succeeded, then what would have happened? It would have diminished the legitimacy of the Brexit vote and indirectly to have diminished their own government. So going public, going strongly against Russia, and meeting that there was interference would have diminished their own political standing, would have weakened their government. And so when there's an alignment of interest between the democratic government in charge and a foreign power that is or has interfered, then this is a very dangerous position because the democratic government might choose its party interest before the national interest. And last point that I've not mentioned before, but that I found consistently in all three case studies is that security agencies, intelligence agencies tend to be reluctant to monitor social media, to monitor free speech for information manipulation, and even more so when it is to take remediation action, right? And that is because there is a careful balance in a democracy between, you know, preventing interference and stopping foreign interference from happening, and guaranteeing free speech, right? And back then in 2016, 2017, intelligence agencies were very skeptical. They really didn't want to get involved with this because it's a very sensitive topic in a democracy. You don't want your intelligence services to start saying this is fake news or not, this is allowed speech or not, because you might really quickly move into censorship, right? And so that left a kind of an opening for foreign powers to do whatever they wanted. There have been some progress since then. We can talk about that in the Q&A. But you know, the British, the French, the Americans, they've all developed their own policy unit, or in the French case, they are their own dedicated agency for monitoring and preventing election interference. But back then in 2016, 17, this was kind of a strategic surprise. The security services weren't prepared, really. And this is a debate, I think, that is still going on in some countries. And it's something that we should talk more about. So these are the big three findings. I only have a few minutes left because I want to have at least a bit of a Q&A time. So let's take a minute to talk about further research. Obviously, AI-generated content and the use of AI to make foreign interference and information manipulation stronger, more effective, and at scale. This is a big topic. A lot of further research is required in that field. We've seen, for instance, only a couple of weeks ago in Indonesia, some of the candidates using AI-generated videos for their campaigning to use a loophole in the electoral laws. So this is already happening, and we need to look into it. As for my own theory, there is still a lot of work to do with it. We could expand testing the theory in non-Western democracies, because this is one of the limitations of my work, but also illiberal democracies, so imperfect democracies, and also autocracies, because some autocracies do have elections, and they also are sometimes victims of election interference. And so it would be interesting to look at how autocracies manage this balancing of threats whether they have a different threat perception, because there is a whole lot of academic literature on these variables specifically for autocracies. But obviously, we've not had time to look into that. That's out of the scope of my research for now. So this is just to give you some ideas. I will stop here. I know that some of the slides were quite heavy in the research design stage, so I will stop here and open the floor for questions.
Thanks, Arthur, for that amazing lecture. It was very interesting. I myself have a background in international relations, but not in cyber. So I just found a lot of what you were saying very interesting and also very relatable, seeing things pop up in the news as they've been happening and wondering, oh, is this a cyber attack? Is Trump going on a rant about this being fake? All these different things. So very nice to be able to get some real life examples as well. I'm taking a look at the Q&A chat and I don't see anything in there yet, but I have a few questions myself. So guys, please, if you have a question, please drop it in the Q&A and I can ask Arthur directly. Because we won't be calling on people. It's too difficult with the muting and unmuting. So if you can drop it in the Q&A, that would be great. Otherwise, I will start. I hope you can access the Q&A box. Can you guys perhaps give me some thumbs up if you can? Because if you can't, that would be an issue. If you can access the Q&A box, give a thumbs up. Okay, so it's working. All right, great. Well, I'll just go ahead and ask my first question. You mentioned useful idiots, deep divisions, polarization, and I'm also just thinking like with all the conspiracy theories, the rise of AI, deep fakes, etc., how do we ensure fair elections in today's age? And do we need to rethink how elections are and how they should go, given how given how vulnerable the current system is to electoral fraud and cyber attacks like these?
I think you need first to address the assumption, right? And the assumption is that all elections are vulnerable and all elections are equally vulnerable. And I don't think that's the case, right? There are dozens, if not more, different forms of democracies, of democratic systems, and of elections, right? For instance, right here, I'm in Switzerland at the moment, which is a confederal state with many parliaments, a quite complex system, but it is also a country that is famous for its direct democracy, with lots of referendums that are able to dictate to parliament how some laws should be acted on. So this is just an example, and you also have, traditionally parliamentary systems, like in Germany or the UK, and you have more presidential systems like France and the US, and they tend to have different ways of voting. And very different political cultures as well. Like in the Netherlands, in Germany, everything relies a lot on coalitions to make things work. And so that means that elections there are less reliant on one party and one candidate. That means that maybe these kind of elections are more complex to influence, because versus the US, where you have swing states and only two parties, and it might be easier to just influence a couple of swing states in one way or another to just shift the balance. Now that once that you said that, I think there are some important ways, but the most important thing to keep in mind is that you need public opinion, you need people, you need your citizens to trust the process, right? Whatever you do, it depends a lot on the local political culture, but it's all a matter of trust, really. Whatever you do, if the election is not perceived as being trustworthy, then your efforts are not sufficient, right?
Yeah.
And again,
Stops
we're
people
seeing
from
this.
voting as well.
Yes, exactly. So we're seeing this in the US particularly, where people say increasingly so. I mean, I've heard um, some secretaries of states or some especially Republican representatives saying, look, it doesn't matter what actually happens. If our voters think that the elections are not trustworthy, then they are not trustworthy, right? And so it's all about perceptions and what people think. So obviously you need to take technical measures and policy measures to make sure that the elections are secure and reliable from, factually. But you need a lot of, um, let's say, communications to and involvement from civil society to make sure that everyone is on board and everyone realizes that the elections are indeed trustworthy if they are.
Great. Thanks for that answer. I don't see any things in the Q&A, and I don't want to hijack this by asking all of my questions, but I have seen some hands up, so I'm going to assume that it's not working. And Mark Harris, I see that your hand is up. Lufuno, I see that your hand is up, so I'm just going to try and unmute you, and you can ask your question directly to Arthur himself. Please, only questions about the lecture and not about the SANCS course overall. So, Mark, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. Please ask your question to, or allow your mic. So please unmute yourself and ask your question to Arthur.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, I did have a question. I'm trying to record it there. The reason I kept raising my hand is because the Q&A isn't enabled.
Okay.
And this isn't the first sort of lecture. So when I've got a question or would like to ask, I know that there's issues with the mics and that, but one can't post your question in the Q&A chat because a lot of the sessions it's not enabled. So it makes it a bit of a challenge.
Okay, that's strange. It should be enabled and it has been working for previous lectures. So I will look into that. Thank you for making me aware of that. But for now, I guess we will try and do it this way where we can see if the connection is good enough for people to ask their own questions, and I'll make sure that it's fixed for the lecture after this. It's a bit of a shame.
Okay, no problem. Like
Okay.
I said, I don't have anything specific. It's just I wanted to raise the technical issue with Q&A not working.
Okay, great. Thank you. Appreciate that. I will go on to the next person that has their hand raised then. Lufuno, I am going to allow your mic. Please unmute yourself and ask Arthur your question.
All the lectures I've attended, I've never been able to use the Q&A because it's turned off my side. So when we keep raising the hand, it's not undermining you, it's because we can use the Q&A. My question is, do you think that as developing countries, I'm in South Africa and we're having elections this year, do you think that we have capacity to create appropriate governance and monitor online content during campaign, as you said, and enforce the sanctions that are necessary? I'm saying I'm asking this in a sense that within a context of where the elections have the interest of the nation at heart, not their party interest or whatever. So I'm asking in that context, do we have the capacity to protect the elections and our democracy?
Thank you. Thank you, Lufuno. Yes, I got your question. Yes, indeed. So you have really important elections coming. In South Africa, it's especially challenging because of the political context. And well, you mentioned the issue of regulating information manipulation potentially. I mean, this is what I read into your question. Yes, I mean, we kind of know what is working and not working, but again, it depends on the political culture and the sensitivity of each country. Some things in some countries are acceptable, and in other countries they are not. Um, France, for instance, has a pretty strong regulation of the media during electoral campaigns. You have blackout laws. You have quite strong regulator that is able to enforce fair representation of all candidates across the media, print, TV, and everything. And some of these things are acceptable in some countries and are not in others. So what I would say first is that you might not be able to just import something that works in a different country and apply it to your own country, like without modifying anything. That might not necessarily work. Now that I've said this, having effective and accepted norms, and then regulators that have the teeth to enforce these rules. This is really important indeed, right? To take another example, we've seen during the Brexit campaign in the UK that the Electoral Commission and the Information Commissioner's Office, they lacked a lot of legal power, right? They sometimes didn't have enough legal ground to go after some breaking of electoral rules, or when there was something, they could not really. I mean, the fines that they could impose was really just anecdotal. So you need to make sure that the rules, the electoral rules, the campaigning rules, potential media blackouts, the fair representation of candidates, potential laws against information manipulation. We've seen that this is working in some countries like France and also in Taiwan, but you always have to make sure that these are not perceived as partisan, right? They need to be as fair as possible, and so to be independent from the political power. They need to still have quite enough legal and financial powers still to be able to do their work, and they need to be adapted to the political culture of the country. I think these are the three important things.
Great. Thanks, Arthur. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah,
I think we have
thank
time
you.
for... Oh, great. Thanks. I think we have time for one more. And I see one hand up from Wilfred. So Wilfred, I'm going to allow your mic, and could you please unmute yourself and ask Arthur your question?
Okay, good afternoon. Quite an interesting topic indeed. It just raises a bit of concern now that we are in an election year, and I'm made to understand that there's over 30 countries that are going through to elections this year, and a very contested aspect of this is the observation. Observers come from different multilateral organizations across the globe, right? Invited by a particular country that does elections on a particular point in time. Now, you having gone through and given us, so much about the insights of what happens behind the scenes from an intelligence and cybersecurity point of view, to what extent, does these observers, when they come out ultimately to say these elections were either free or not free and fair and so on, do they consider, to what extent do they consider all of these aspects, of this digital subversive, probably, activities that may have influenced negatively or positively an outcome of a particular election? And maybe a linked question, yes, would be, what kind of skill sets would a country, for instance, consider for an organization that must come in and now as a third party to assist in terms of this back office, monitoring, detection, management and response kind of activity.
Thank you. Thank you for your question, Wilfred. So I'm not an expert in election observation, right? It's a whole subset topic, but I'm a little bit familiar with it. What tends to happen is that the most visible thing that happens is that people physically come in and look at what happens at voting places. But this is not the only thing that happens when observers or international organizations make determinations on whether the election in a specific country was free and fair. Typically, in Europe, we have the OSCE who tends to do this, who tends to do this, and their reports are publicly available, and you'll see that they go through a lot of non-physical processes, right? They don't just go into the voting booth or the voting places and see what happens. They also do look indeed at the digital space. They look at whether there was censorship of speech in physical spaces and and online, right, on social media or elsewhere. They also tend to look at whether there was equal representation of all candidates or all sides in the media. They also look at financial fairness rules, right? Are there funding limits? Are they enforced and controlled? Is there an effective separation between the state and the parties? Things like this, right? So it tends to be quite comprehensive when you have, especially when it's an international organization that does determination of whether the election is free and fair in a specific country. They don't just go into voting place to look at the very obvious cases of fraud, as we've seen them in Russia, for instance, in the past couple of weeks. Now, and you've also asked about the capabilities that would be required to do this. If you also want to get into like disinformation research, election information, cyber-enabled election interference research, well, it can be quite challenging because you need experts at social media intelligence, open source intelligence. You need people specifically trained to look for state disinformation because, well, I focus on foreign election interference, right? But you also have a lot wider field in terms of domestic interference, right? Which is maybe something you were referring to, I'm not sure. And then you have some people that do this. For instance, at the Digital Forensic Research Lab at the Atlantic Council, you have people that do this at Stanford University Internet Observatory, very competent people there. But you are right in the assumption of your question, which is that it is quite a challenging thing to do. And some NGOs can come in and help in places that don't, that do not benefit from enough interest from these big organizations, because this is a challenging thing to do. It requires money and most importantly, skills. And yeah, and skills is the most difficult thing to find.
Hope that answered your question, Wilfred. If it didn't, we are unfortunately out of time, but I just want
No,
to...
thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay,
Much
great. Great. I would like everyone to give Arthur a digital round of applause if you can. Yeah, thank you so much for this lecture, Arthur. It was very, very intriguing, very interesting, especially with all of the elections coming up this year. It's given us a lot of food for thought. I don't know if you can see the reactions, but there are lots of reactions down here, lots of digital emoji applauses. Yes, so just want to thank you again. Oh, there's someone is not. Oh, whoever is speaking, could you please mute yourself? Okay, great. Yeah. Perfect. Just want to thank you again for giving us your time and your insights and for speaking to everybody in the room today. For everybody else, could you please get on to the next lecture link, which is going to start in about 8 or 10 minutes. So we will see you there. Once again, thank you, Arthur, and we hope to see you next year.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Arthur. Thank you very much.
Bye, guys. See you in the next link.
Thank you.